I want to turn to the topic of the day, medical trade wars, the search for drugs, devices, and PPE. This is the second of what will be 10 training programs on global trade issues. This is sponsored by the Heinrich Foundation. We are going to have experts from all over the globe talking about different aspects of global supply chains and primarily how they're been affected by and reacting to coronavirus. Today we're talking, as I said, about medical issues. Since the start of COVID-19, we've battled shortages of simple protective agreements, runs on hydroxychloroquine that impacted the availability of existing users to access it, and fears that ventilator shortages would doom many COVID patients in overwhelmed hospitals. That the medical supply chain issues are happening in the US, a nation that spends a greater share of its economy on healthcare than anybody else, is alarming. Our technology and research advances and our surgeons are the best in the world, but we can't supply hospitals with little cloth masks. That's one of the things we're going to get in today. Our three experts will lead us through supply chain issues that bedevil drugs, devices, and other medical supplies. We're joined by Rosemary Gibson, author of China RX, Sébastien Miroudot of the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, and Gereffi, director of the Global Value Chain Center at Duke University. First up, we're going to go to Rosemary. She's a senior advisor at the Hastings Center, a biomedical think tank. She's also the author of, as I said, China RX, Exposing the Risks of America's Dependence on China for Medicine, which gets to the heart of looming problems in the pharmaceutical supply chain. Each of our speakers will talk for 7 or 8 minutes. A couple of them will have slideshows that they'll be showing you. After we've heard from all of our speakers, we will turn it over to Q&A. If you want to ask a question, you'll see the little raise my hand button at the bottom. Raise your hand and you can ask an audio question. When it's time, I'll call on you and we'll unmute you and you can ask your question to one or all three of the panelists. You can also submit questions by text. And so as those questions are coming in, we'll be looking at them and we will get to as many of those as we can during the program. So once again, I want to thank Rosemary for joining us today. I'm going to turn the floor over to you now.
The topic is U.S. dependence on China for medicine. The content here would be applicable to most countries around the world. Next slide, please. As Chris mentioned, this work is the result of 3 years of research that culminated in China RX. Next slide, please. I'll make 4 points today. How dependent is the United States on China for medicine? What is FDA not telling us? How did we become dependent? It's more than just lower costs. And what are the risks? Interruptions in supply, shortages, and quality problems. Next slide, please. This is a piece from an industry trade press in 2012. Dangers aside, drug makers can't live with Chinese APIs. That means active pharmaceutical ingredients. It's what makes a medicine medicine. Without API, there's no medicine. So this has been happening for a very long period of time. Next slide, please. How dependent are we? This is a testimony from an official from the Defense Department to the U.S.-China Economic and Security Review Commission last summer, who said, the national security risks of increased Chinese dominance of the global API market cannot be overstated. Next slide. This is testimony at the House Energy and Commerce Health Subcommittee last year by Michael Wessel, a member of the commissioner on the U.S.-China Commission, who said China is the world's largest supplier of these core ingredients, APIs. Next slide, please. This is a letter from the bipartisan letter from senators to the Secretary of Defense, Mark Esper, discussing the Defense Department's dramatic dependence on China. And they were calling for a meeting with the Defense Department to move forward on what should be done. Next slide, please. What is the FDA not telling us? This is data from FDA testimony to the House Energy and Commerce Health Subcommittee last summer. And the way the data is portrayed, it appears as if the US is not too dependent on China. On the left side is the number of API manufacturing facilities And looks like China doesn't have that many facilities compared to the US, so it doesn't seem to look very bad. And on the right side is the percentage of API manufacturing facilities. And once again, it appears as if China is not dominant. Next slide, please. Here's what the FDA doesn't tell us. We have to look at the tip of the triangle. At the bottom, we have the finished drugs, the pills that we take, the vials of medicines. They're made with the active ingredients, what we talked about, what makes the medicine medicine. FDA regulates the API facilities and finished drugs. But what the FDA is not telling us is where do APIs come from? They don't fall from the sky. They're made with raw materials and chemical intermediates, molecules. And this is where China has dominant global market share. These are called key starting materials. And the FDA doesn't tell us this information because it doesn't know, because it doesn't regulate them. And if it doesn't regulate them, it doesn't count the facilities. This is globally where China is dominant. And how do we know that? Next slide, please. Again, what are these key starting materials? There are thousands of them. They're molecules, raw materials, antibiotic fermentation plants from pigs. And companies keep this information, like Fort Knox, a closely guarded secret. Next slide. I'll just say I've seen these, what I call regrettable statements, where the US Chamber of Commerce says that the US manufacturers already meet 70% of pharmaceutical demand, came out earlier this month. They can't meet that demand without dependence on China for thousands of the core components, these raw materials and starting materials. Next slide. So what do we know about the sourcing of these key starting materials? Next slide. India depends on China for 69% of what it needs for its huge generic industry. And we know that from the India Directorate of Commercial Intelligence and Statistics, which reported that earlier this year. Next slide. This is came out earlier this month from a PhD chemist who works in the industry on the branded side. And he says right now it's even difficult to be able to operate your supply chain without China. And this pertains to both branded drugs and generic drugs. Next slide, please. A Dutch documentary aired last year, and more recently an update version this year. China owns the global raw materials market. This is a quote from a gentleman who worked in the European industry for more than 30 years. Next slide. And he also noted, this is in the Netherlands, we're afraid that China will do things to deprive us of our medicines. So while there might be trade issues with the United States and China, this is a concern that many countries around the world have. Next slide. How we got here? It's usually, next slide please, it's usually thought that China's cheaper because of its labor costs and subsidies to its companies. But in fact, there's something else going on, which we document in China RX, a case study of the closure of the last penicillin plant in the United States. Why did it happen? Because China formed a cartel. It fixed prices and controls supply to the US and other countries. It has government subsidies and manipulates its currency. Next slide, please. This is data from European industry leaders. Briefly, the bar graphs are global production. The sub-bar graphs are Chinese production, again, subsidized by the Chinese government. US companies are effectively competing against the Chinese government, not other companies. And watch that yellow line, which is price. And in 2004, there was a significant drop, and it was in price, global price, and it was kept low for 4 years. That began in 2004, and that is when the last penicillin plant in the United States announced it was closing, because China's predatory trade practices drive out their competitors. And once they gain dominant global market share, prices go back up. Even India's penicillin producers were driven out of business during this time. So India depends on China for penicillin and other antibiotic components. Next slide, please. And this is the pattern for other products. And people ask, well, what is this industrial base? What countries lose is huge infrastructure. The closure of the last penicillin plant in the US meant the demolishing of 50 buildings that once produced 70% of the world's supply. And so why we have shortages of antibiotics and so much else is because part of it is the concentration of production in a single country and fewer suppliers. That's just one factor. Next slide, please. What are the risks? We've talked about shortages and interruptions in supply, but I want to close with this 90-second video. This is a retired Army colonel who's a commissioner on the U.S.-China Economic and Security Review Commission, who just mentioned offhand during a hearing on this subject about his own experience about the concerns about quality. As some of you may remember, there were blood pressure medicines recalled beginning in July 2018, and and millions of people around the world were adversely affected, including people here.
The line of questions and responses just struck me, and I have to say I'm a military retiree. As a consequence, if I take regular prescriptions, I'm required to use Express Scripts.
Yes, sir.
They do a great job. In the past 3 months, I have had 4 blood pressure medications recalled. When I tracked down the sourcing, they all came out of India, but originally sourced in China. They're from 4 different U.S. supposed manufacturers, at least providers, companies. In each case, that particular medication was contaminated with rocket fuel. If you did a little work on the internet, you could figure that out. So I know it's not your fault, but I think it's really important that something be done about this by the Department of Defense and the U.S. government in general. The other medication wasn't contaminated with rocket fuel, but again, 3 recalls in a 3-month period. I mean, I imagine active duty people have the same problem, and that affects the readiness of our force.
Oh, that's fascinating. Rocket fuel. So, Rosemary, let me ask you one quick question, then we'll move on to Sébastien. You were talking about the key starting materials. Does China make all of those itself, or is it just consolidated production, taken production from around the country and kind of consolidated it for then re-exporting?
China produces these raw materials and core chemicals. It has to its credit, it developed a vast industry, because if you have 1.3 billion people, you need medicines to care for them. But the manner in which they did it was through a lot of unfair trade practices. But China has the dominant production of these core components.
And give me one example of what one of these KSMs is.
There's a chemical molecule that's needed to make a very important antibiotic called ciprofloxacin. Mm-hmm. And that is an anthrax exposure antidote. And it's used for many other purposes in the treatment of infectious disease.
Okay. All right. So now we will turn to Sébastien. Sébastien Miroudot is a senior trade policy analyst at the OECD Trade and Agricultural Directorate. He's based in Paris. And he's going to talk with us about trade interdependencies in various COVID-19 goods. He also has a slideshow. So Tyler, if you could pull that up, then I'll turn it over to Sébastien.
Okay, well, thanks, Chris. Good afternoon. Thank you for the National Press Foundation for this invitation. I have through a few slides where I would like to share with you some work we have done at OECD on trade in COVID-19 related goods and also on the face mask global value chain. So what we try to do is to gather some data on the goods that were essential to fight the coronavirus. We can see the next slide. But to be clear, the goods I'm talking about are really things like the test kits, the protective garments, the medical devices, the disinfectants. But my data, for example, do not include pharmaceuticals. I mean, one reason is that, unfortunately, there is no cure or no treatment for COVID-19. I mean, we can talk later about whether there were some shortages related to some of the medicine that are used. But to be clear, and a difference with the previous presentation is that the data I'm sharing with you now do not cover pharmaceuticals. But if you think about all these protective equipment and goods that were really key in fighting the coronavirus, you can see that looking at global export and the top exporters, you have 5 countries that account for about 50% of all exports, and that's Germany, the United States, Switzerland, China, and Ireland. So note that China is only number 4. So if we talk about dependence, most countries would say they depend more on export from Germany, the United States, or Switzerland than China. Then if you look at the chart at the bottom, you see also the top importers, and they tend to be the same as the top exporters, but with some differences. And you see that the United States somehow stand out in terms of the main importer of these COVID-19 related goods, with a share of 18%, which may explain some of the debates in the US. But somehow what we see is that the top importers are also top exporters. So what we have is really what we call the intra-industry trade, where countries really specialize in a specific good. So that's what we can see on the next slide. When we go to more detailed data, we will see that the top exporter of face mask is China. But if we look at intubation kits, the top exporter is the United States. If we look at gloves, surgical gloves, it's Malaysia, and so on. So what we have is that really countries have specialized in specific types of COVID-19 goods and exchange amongst themselves, depend on each other for the provision of these goods. And it's really a world of trade interdependencies, where not a single country is able to fully produce all the range of goods you need to fight the pandemic. Now, if we move to the next slide, I would like also to share with you the work we have done on the face mask global value chain. So first, let me say that we are lucky to have Gereffi in our panel. He's the one who created and promoted this type of analysis, and I think it's very useful in the context of COVID-19 to understand what's going on and to try to explain the shortages. So we have identified at least 3 types of bottlenecks in the face mask value chain. First, there is an important bottleneck in terms of the supply of a key input. So the technical name is the melt-blown fabric, which is manufactured with polypropylene. It's a key input to manufacture the filtering layer in the face mask. And it's in shortage because it's a very technical production technique, and you need huge investment to produce the specific polymer and the type of fabric needed. The second bottleneck, it's in the middle of the value chain, really the final assembly of this face mask. So you have many companies that now are trying also to step in and produce this face mask. But clearly there was a shortage, which was explained by the surge in demand. So when you ask the manufacturers, they estimate that the demand for their production was increased by a factor of maybe 50. And the main reason why there was a global shortage is this surge in demand. And we can come back to this later. But then there were many also bottlenecks at the end of the value chain in the distribution networks. So of course, in the context of the shortage, these distribution networks, whether they were private or public, were really disorganized and under important stress. But also you had bottlenecks through some policies, because some countries producing face masks started to put export restrictions, and it prevented from other countries to access this key good. But I'm happy to come back to this during the discussion, and I will leave it there for my introductory remarks. Thank you.
Okay, Sébastien. So one quick, Tyler, if you keep these slides show up and just go back to the slide with the bars, with the graphic with the vertical bars. Sébastien, just a quick question for journalists out there who are looking for data resources. Where do these data come from? Is this OEC data or WTO data? Where does it come from?
Okay, so the source is a trade data set called BASI from a French organization called CEPI, but this data will be are available in the OECD note, and I think you have the link to download this paper. Let me also say that you had similar work done by WTO and some other international organization. But so basically what we call the COVID-19 related goods, you have some kind of official list released by the World Customs Organization. So in the trade statistics, they have identified all the goods that were discussed in the context of COVID-19, and we are all using this list. But let me also say that these data are quite aggregated and are not always well covering very specific products. So you have some technical issues. I don't have time to enter into the detail, but we are all relying on some of the same definition of this COVID-19 goods, and you can find different sources with this data, and I'm happy to share some link if people are interested in seeing the specific data.
Okay, so thank you much. And as Sébastien noted, he wrote a research note on the N95 masks, specifically describing the manufacturing process, all the layers that go into the making of those masks, and that's something that after today's session, we will have a long list of resources that journalists can use to access data sources, other news stories that have been done on these topics, the work of these three experts, and other analyses that are out there that could be helpful for you in doing a story. We have some questions coming in. We have one more speaker, and then we'll have full Q&A. If you would like to ask a question, we will be giving priority to journalists who are on deadline. So if you're on a deadline, let us know. Raise your hand so you can ask an audio question. And after we hear from Gary, we will get to those questions. So we have with us now Gary Gereffi. He's been director of the Global Value Chain Center at Duke University for 15 years. He's also an emeritus professor of sociology. He's going to give us some insights on whether these shortages that we're seeing in things like masks are market failure or a policy failure. So I'll turn it over to Gary.
Thank you, Chris. Good day to everybody. The topic I want to address, I think, will complement the presentations you heard from Rosemary and Sébastien. And I really want to zero in on this question of reshoring of production as it relates to these medical products. We've been hearing, as a result of the significant ramp up in demand and the shortages in these products, that in some ways COVID-19 is actually perhaps the end of globalization as we know it, that the global supply chains have not been able to deal with these kinds of problems, and there's very real dependencies for critical resources, as Rosemary pointed out in some of the pharmaceutical cases. So the question is whether reshoring to a country like the US, very large, is going to be a solution to some of these problems. I believe that domestic production in these medical devices and personal protective equipment is definitely going to increase in the next few years, but that it's not going to displace or replace globalization per se. I think the advantages of international production, trade, and innovation far outweigh the disadvantages, but clearly a rebalancing is needed. And I want to highlight in my remarks 4 issues or key objectives that I think are going to shape the reshoring of these products. One has to do with efficiency considerations, particularly cost and availability of these drugs. Second, security. Third, jobs. And fourth, innovation. I think those 4 factors, efficiency, security, jobs, and innovation, have trade-offs among themselves in terms of what we can expect from reshoring. So let me just give a few examples of each one. The efficiency considerations boil down in part to low cost. I think low cost is one of the major reasons we've seen this growth of these global supply chains and global production networks. And it's especially important for medical devices. So products like the N95 masks that Sébastien was talking about in normal times cost less than $1 a mask in terms of how they're produced. And things like surgical gloves or medical gowns are also very, very inexpensive in these current global production arrangements. And I think, as Sebastian's data showed, each of these products actually comes from a number of different countries that have certain advantages. The problem with the coronavirus pandemic is that the demand escalated not just in the US, but all around the world to levels that would be sort of unimaginable before the pandemic. So the normal supply, for example, of the N95 masks in the US was around 50 million masks a month. And most of those were actually devoted to industrial use, factory workers using the mask to keep out dangerous particles or materials in the workplace. Only 15 or 20% were actually for medical use. Well, with the pandemic, the demand shot up from 50 million masks a month to 300 million masks a month, and almost all of those for medical use. So one of the problems was the ramp up that was required in the supply chain meant that big companies like 3M and Honeywell in the US and smaller suppliers have had to increase production to 1 billion masks, which is currently what's being supplied from US production and imports, and expected to go up to 2 billion by the end of 2020. But a problem in this ramp up is that the complexity of these products is actually very substantial from a supply chain point of view. So if you look at the N95 masks, there's 70 different parts that are needed to make the N95 mask, and only some of those are in the US. If you look at ventilators, there's 300 parts. So part of the issues that we need to deal with from a supply chain point of view is the US could focus on particular critical components, but realistically, it can't expect to bring the entire supply chain for all of these products inside the US. So I think we still have to manage these efficiency problems through some kinds of international arrangements, even if we could increase production for some critical products in the US in the short term. That brings me to the second main topic, which is security. I think one of the main arguments in favor of reshoring or domestic production is you could increase the security of essential products. And in the case of the medical devices and pharmaceuticals industry, that's clearly an area where we could imagine that there are a number of key products for healthcare needs. And one of the ways you can increase supply is through stockpiles. That's one of the arguments. We have a national stockpile of key products, but there's a few key problems with stockpiles. I mean, one of them was alluded to actually in Rosemary's presentation. Even if you take a particular class of drugs like antibiotics, there's many, many types of antibiotics that have different uses. So, and the number of active pharmaceutical ingredients, which is what you really want to focus on to create the medicines, itself is very large. So one problem is if we're going to create stockpiles, we'd have to determine which drugs are really essential. Secondly, we have to know how large the stockpiles can be. Third, there's a problem of technology lock-in. If we create stockpiles even of the N95 masks, we introduce the technology at the time we create the stockpile that will continue to change. And finally, stockpiles degrade over time. So you have to have a way of using stockpiles if you're going to build them up. Third topic, I'll be quick on this, is jobs. And thank you. And the jobs front, Robert Lighthouser, U.S. Trade Representative, wrote an op-ed in the New York Times recently about whether the era of outsourcing of U.S. jobs is over. And so there's a big concern about bringing production back to create more U.S. jobs. But one problem is that most manufacturing nowadays has become increasingly automated. There's fewer jobs, and the jobs that exist require higher skills. So almost every industry that might have moved offshore from the US or other advanced industrial countries over the last 15, 20 years has become more automated, more skilled. So to bring it back isn't going to solve the jobs problem in numbers, but it is going to create an issue in terms of skills. Let me come back to the final point of innovation, which I think is a really critical one for the US economy. And the question is, can reshoring or bringing production back help with innovation? And there's some ways it can. So for example, in ventilators, the US government issued contracts to try to create lower cost ventilators that could be made in the US. And in fact, they gave an award back around 2011, 2012 to a startup company that could produce, that was going to develop a US ventilator for $3,000 per ventilator instead of the normal price of $10,000. And they came up with such a ventilator through the government contract. Problem was that this company got bought up in a phase of industry consolidation by a much larger company. And that larger company did not want to release the lower cost ventilator because it would undercut its more profitable products. So one problem with market competition is even if we create some incentives for innovation, it's not clear that you can force that distribution unless the government plays a very active role in keeping that out there. But I just want to mention two final topics. Vaccines is probably the biggest area of R&D right now in this field because everybody knows that creation of vaccines is what you would need to stop the pandemic. I think there's a global innovation race for vaccines. There is no way that any one country or even any one company in a country is going to control that. So I think we need to have the innovation on that side be international. Once a vaccine's discovered, the production is going to be a massive undertaking. It'll probably have to take place in many countries around the world, close to where demand is largest. So for vaccines, production isn't the most profitable part of it. It's the finding of the vaccine and patenting it. Final example, my last point, testing. Surprisingly, in a sort of a global value chain world, one of the simpler products has become one of the toughest problems, which is the testing kits. And we've heard in the US how simple things like cotton swabs or chemical reagents aren't available, so the whole kit isn't created. Well, we just had an announcement 2 weeks ago that a new 1-hour test for antibodies for COVID-19 was produced by National University of Singapore in collaboration with Duke University and a joint program they have. I think it seems like it's going to have a lot of potential, but I raise that as an example that innovation is got to be international because there's so many different universities and companies working on this. But once we have the innovation, we can probably bring some of that production back to the US. So I wanted to just emphasize with these remarks that the trade-offs between efficiency, security, jobs, innovation, all of them can favor some kinds of production back in the US, but it can't be covering the full range of these products. So I think some kind of international production and trade is still going to be important in order to assure the availability of these products for COVID-19 and any crises that arise down the road.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, Gary. So let's turn to some questions. Again, if you want to ask a question, look down to the bottom of your screen and raise your hand, or you can. And so we'll have you ask the question by audio, or you can write your question in. The first question is going to be an audio question to Jillian Deutsch of Politico. Tyler, if you could unmute her, and we'll turn the floor over to Jillian.
Hi, can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Great, thanks so much. I'm really curious about safety checks in supply chains because right now, obviously, governments are trying to acquire face masks and ventilators as quickly as possible. You know, they're trying to get car manufacturers to produce ventilators. I'm wondering if you're seeing, though, that there are any safety risks in trying to get people who are not specialized in producing these kinds of equipment, or if you're seeing even tests getting being put on the market too quickly because they're not being checked by the proper authorities.
I can maybe make a quick comment on that one. I think that the fact that all of these products are pretty highly regulated introduces some checks on the safety side of this. And I think if you can get experienced manufacturers like car makers, they would work closely with regulatory authorities probably to make sure that the products meet standards. But it turns out that there's surprising liability issues with the N95 mask in particular that I think have created some problems. So for example, the industrial masks that were made by companies like 3M, the largest producer of the N95 masks, don't have a permeable filter that would keep liquids out, which is critical to use it as a medical mask. And so while the US government was trying to ramp up production of these masks, there was a 3 to 4 week delay while the liability issue was getting sorted out because the industry for a long while had not wanted to upgrade or transform the industry mask into the medical mask without some kind of liability waiver. So I think this points to the complexity of that quality problem. There are quality standards, there's regulations, but in actually trying to meet them, you sometimes can run up against tricky legal issues and other things that the manufacturers have to be paying attention to. So we need strong regulation for sure.
Okay. Rosemary, do you have any thoughts about FDA oversight of the pharmaceutical quality process?
Yes, thank you, Chris. Well, the FDA has removed inspectors from countries around the world because of the COVID situation to protect federal employees. And so that means that our medicines and their components that are being made in countries around the world are not being regulated. And the FDA is not set up to test every batch of product before it sells it. In the masks issue, some of you may have seen that 65 companies in China that were making masks for the United States, they didn't meet standards. They were tested after the fact, and that was just to meet demand. And they were found that they were not protecting healthcare workers and the public. A challenge is companies that make products here in the U.S. can be held liable. But if we have imported products from certain countries, it's very hard to hold them accountable. So the variation in liability, but that said, the public should expect high quality products and enforcement of that, no matter where they come from. And that's a challenge, particularly when surge capacity and demand is so enormous.
Okay, thanks. So we have another audio question from Dinah Pulver, who is with USA Today's Regional Investigative Unit based out of Florida, I believe. Dinah, we will unmute you and you can ask your question.
I have so many questions, but I think the first one is a little more information about the 70 parts that are in an N95 mask, because that number just kind of blows you away.
Yeah, and sorry, so that has been maybe Sébastien, you wanna comment on that since you've done the case study.
Yeah. I mean, you have to think. So what we call the N95 respirator is also a piece of cloth. So it's like the surgical mask, but it has some shape to cover the mouth and the nose. So here, I mean, you have like 3 layers, and the difference with the surgical mask is that these layers go through some high pressure, high temperature rollers to mold the mask and to give this shape. But maybe you were talking more about the ventilators, which are like a mechanical piece of equipment with a lot of inputs and parts and components. But otherwise, what we call the N95 respirator is one higher grade quality of the surgical mask, and it's part of the face mask. But then you have these more complex machines like the ventilators with lots of parts and components coming from different countries.
Okay.
Okay.
You have one more follow-up there, Dinah?
No, just come back to me later.
Sure, will do. Okay, so we have a question from Shannon Teo, who is the Malaysia Bureau Chief for the Straits Times. And Shannon asks, there's an ongoing race to develop a vaccine for COVID-19, but given China controls production of most pharma reagents, does this give them a leverage no matter who comes up with the actual vaccine formula? Rosemary or Gary, do you have thoughts on that?
Rosemary.
Hi, thank you, Gary, and thank you, Chris. Thanks you for the question. It's true, if you control the core components to make a vaccine, that certainly gives you an advantage and potential monopoly position over the manufacturer of it.
Mm-hmm.
And how big of a problem is that for us?
It's huge. We can't make any, aside from vaccines, infectious diseases can be bacterial in nature, and we need generic antibiotics, the mainline ones. And we can't make antibiotics anymore. We can't make the antibiotics for pneumonia, strep throat, bronchitis, to treat sepsis. We depend on China largely for those core chemicals, as does the world. So it's a very, very difficult situation for products that are potentially life-saving.
Okay. Now we have a question from Valerie Diamond, who is from Healthcare Business News. For hospital system supply chains in the U.S., especially those operating in COVID-19 hotspots, do you have any recommendations, alternative supply sources, et cetera, for treating and protecting patients and themselves right now?
Well, I'll just jump in on that.
Sure.
You know, I think we need to look at the just-in-time delivery system that distributors have used for many years. And so hospitals would get, you know, shipments of gloves and other protective gear in normal times every 2 days when things were operating normally. But when we have the current situation with multiple things happening, that system just doesn't work anymore. Per Gary's point, at a minimum level, we might need some minimum level of self-sufficiency in manufacturing of these products at a time when you have a global pandemic. 100 countries affected, we're all competing for the same products, and 75 countries have banned exports of medicines and or supplies. So we've got to really look at that whole supply chain and what were the failure points, and certainly how those products are distributed is a key factor.
Could I just follow up on the just-in-time part of the answer? Because I think part of what just-in-time production has created is a system that uses low inventories, as low as possible. And so even some of the big manufacturers are arguing that to keep these supply chains lean, they don't want to have stockpiles or inventories, but that's been especially true for hospitals. Hospitals have been under such cost containment pressures that the idea of building up inventories meant for them less money to be used on other products. And so I think that the trade-off again here is just-in-time isn't just a production system, it's a financial system. And hospitals have been doing a lot of this low inventory management as a way to try to cut costs, but then that doesn't prepare them or us for this kind of surge in an industry. And a lot of the surges or crises used to be localized in particular places. It might be because of a natural disaster or a weather problem or a particular country. This pandemic has created a global surge, so it's meant that this entire system has become particularly vulnerable to disruptions because just-in-time can't work on either the supply side or on the purchasing side from the point of view of hospitals.
If I can just add one quick point to that, you know, the strategic national stockpile run by the federal government, it was never meant to supply the entire commercial supply of what hospitals need. It was meant, as Gary was alluding, to regional events like a Hurricane Sandy or a Hurricane Maria. It was not meant to be able to restock our whole healthcare system or even in hotspots. So we have to rethink this. And one of the things I'm thinking about is, I did speak to a hospital senior leader, and they do have their own stockpile. And we know these are multi-billion-dollar enterprises, and I think we need a rethinking of that for them to be able to have supplies on hand, maybe a shared, you know, if you're a hospital system with 10, 12 hospitals in a region, it would make sense to do that because we just can't rely on the federal government in the context of a global pandemic.
Okay. So we are next going to take an audio question from Ruth Reeder, who is from Fast Company. Tyler, if you can unmute Ruth. And Ruth, the floor is yours now.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yep.
Great. So one thing I'm curious to get your thoughts on is that, you know, manufacturers in this, drug manufacturers in a pandemic have shifted a lot of their energy towards making COVID-related, whether that's vaccines or drugs or, you know, basically the whole model shifts to that, to serving that pandemic. And that means that other drugs are made less, and sometimes the access to those drugs is compromised, right? So like there has been, especially if we're talking about like hydroxychloroquine, which was thought to be a potential support for this disease. But that means that people who suffer from like malaria then can't get it. And so I'm curious what your thoughts are from a supply chain perspective on like, how do you deal with that? How do you ensure that like other medications can still get to people who need them even when manufacturing resources shift to deal with a pandemic?
I'll take a stab at that, Ruth. One of the points that I've been advocating in my testimony to Congress is that we have the capability to stockpile not just the finished drugs, but the active ingredients, which are the things that make medicines medicines. And when we have a global pandemic or even a regional situation that requires that we have more product, that if we stockpile the API, we can set up manufacturing facilities, real close by, and within weeks we can start producing the finished drug, because making the finished product is a lot easier than making the active ingredient. A challenge is, of course, which drugs, because there are so many, but I think there has been a list. The memo has been written on those critical medicines that healthcare organizations need to function in the best of times, and certainly during a pandemic. So there might be some creative ways to do that. And the reality is, I don't think we will, in a pandemic, avert all shortages, but I do believe that there are means to be able to mitigate them with planning ahead. We plan better for hurricanes than we do for certainly our medicine supply. So I think the COVID-19, if there's a silver lining, it's making us re-question not only our supply chains, manufacturing capability, but innovation in what we do.
If I can add also on this, my impression is that the pharmaceutical industry was maybe better prepared in the sense most of the shortages we have discussed were more related to ventilators, face masks, and not for the drugs. So of course, you can say it's because there was not like a single drug that was suddenly discovered as very efficient against the coronavirus, but we know that there was some tension on some painkillers, on some anesthetics, the drugs that are used to sedate people in intensive care units. And somehow, even if you look across countries, there were sometimes some difficulties. I think the pharmaceutical industry was rather well organized. And one lesson is that even during the pandemic, it was able not only to provide the medicines that were used to deal with the COVID-19 patients, but also other patients. And in what we have studied, we haven't seen similar shortages in the case of pharmaceuticals.
Okay, so let me ask, well, we have some audio questions in the queue and some text questions. Let me take a question now from Patricia Vallone. Governors across the U.S. are secretly purchasing PPE and medical equipment to prevent getting outbid by other states or having it confiscated by the federal government. Talk about the short and long-term ramifications of this, and are any other countries doing the same thing?
Maybe I could just make an initial comment on that. To me, one of the biggest surprises of the COVID pandemic in the U.S. was how inadequate our distribution and allocation system was. Even when the supplies started coming in, the fact that all 50 states and big municipalities in them had different kinds of demand profiles ended up creating this very chaotic situation where it appeared that some states were getting we're getting supplies quicker than others. I think maybe it was Rosemary that mentioned that. I think increasingly what we're starting to see from the bottom up is states beginning to say that they can pool their capacity the same way hospitals might, so that if you got 8 or 10 states that together were in a certain region of the country and they were starting to work to decide how to pool their orders or bids, I think that will end up being a much more stable situation going forward than 50 individual states and trying to keep track of that. But I think that distribution side is critical. It's not just the supply side problem, it's an allocation problem, and that requires having a system in place to hear what all the states and big cities are requiring, and then figuring out a very sophisticated logistics or coordination method. And if we could group some of that demand by states getting together or hospitals getting together, I think that would make the system a bit more efficient.
I'll just add, I think that should also be done for private sector hospitals that themselves were scrambling. There was huge competition to get PPE, and some of them were going outside their distributors. Others felt compelled to stay with their distributors, and that created shortages. So I'd love to see some investigative reporting. We've heard a lot more about what the governors and states and the issues they've had. I'd love to see some investigative reporting on what was going on with hospitals and how their allocation and supply chains were disrupted and the impact that had on patients.
All right. So let's go to a audio question from Andrew Green, who is a European-based freelancer for The Lancet and other publications. Andrew, you're unmuted and you can ask your question.
Great, thanks very much. My question is for Rosemary. I'm wondering if you could kind of expand on something you were talking about earlier. Does Chinese control of active ingredients mean that they could potentially override countries' attempts to use compulsory licenses under TRIPS agreements, TRIPS flexibilities?
Are you talking about the compulsory licenses for branded products, Andrew?
Yes, exactly. So if, potentially like you had a hypothetical scenario where a Chinese manufacturer comes up with a vaccine and then a country tries to claim a compulsory license and China just essentially says, we won't make active ingredients available to you so you can make a generic version of it.
Well, I think that is a very real possibility. I'm hearing reports, very credible reports, not for the branded products. And just so everybody has a clear picture of this, 90% of the medicines we take are generic. Only 10% are branded. That's in the U.S. And China has a real dominant market share of these core components generally. And for those generic antibiotics, I'm hearing reports that China is telling its companies not to send antibiotic material to the United States. So it certainly is the case that China could do that for the branded products under compulsory licenses, as well as for the generic products. This is what happens when you have a global monopoly or close to a monopoly. And that's, I see this as, oil. We wouldn't have 80 or 90% of the world's oil concentrated in a single country. And we wouldn't have 80 or 90% of the world's wheat or corn supply concentrated in a single country. So I think we do need some diversification, and I hope that's a lesson from COVID-19.
Okay, so we have about 5 or so minutes. I see some hands up of people who have already asked a question. If your hand's up for a follow-up, keep it up. If you don't have another question, drop your hand. But this question is a text question from Kat Lucero from MLEX for all panelists. Do you think the U.S. tariffs on COVID-19 related goods made in China was a major cause of the limited supply of those supplies in the U.S.?
I think a lot of the products that were initially proposed for tariffs did not have tariffs. I think global demand and concentration of production in a single country are far much more overriding issues.
I agree.
Okay. We'll go to an audio question back to Jillian Deutsch from Politico. We will get you unmuted. And the floor should be yours here in a second, Jillian. Okay, Jillian, the floor is yours.
Hi, so yeah, I was also just curious whether, this is kind of follow up to the last question, whether the EU's export controls really had major impacts on other countries when it came to supplying protective gear and face masks.
Maybe Sébastien might know something about that one.
Yeah, I mean, it's difficult to say what was the impact, but for sure, I mean, you have a few. I mean, to be clear, many countries have put in place export restrictions, but not all of them are producers of these goods. And one motivation for this export restriction is often hoarding and reselling. So what countries don't want is that some masks, for example, they have imported are resold at a higher price. So they want these masks to be for their citizens. But now it's also clear that some main manufacturers are in Europe, and so there are export restrictions for countries outside the EU. There was also for certain types of goods an export ban in the US, even if some exemptions. So it's clear that some countries, particularly in the developing world, have been impacted by these export bans. And what has happened, for example, in the case of face masks, is that now everybody is relying on China. So China at the beginning, I mean, China never had some kind of export ban, but let's say in January, February, when it was the height of the coronavirus crisis in China, the masks were first for the domestic market, and there were no export. But China has so much increased its production of face masks, according to some data, it has been multiplied by 12, that now it's really the main exporter. So for at least for the face mask, everybody can now access the Chinese mask, which is also interesting in this discussion we had before on the domestic supply, because for many goods now people rely on the global value chain. So now at the beginning of the crisis, and it was a concern with the concentration, like half of the masks were coming from China, but maybe now it's 90%. And there was also, I think, a question on test kits. You have many countries, and in particular Korea, has become one of the main exporters of COVID-19 test kits. And again, you can think, because the test kits, it's not so difficult to produce domestically, but the question is why some countries, including the US, prefer to import these test kits from Korea and rely on global value chains rather than developing this domestic capacity. So clearly, you have some companies, and it's related to their agility, their capacity in the middle of the crisis to source the input and to serve all countries. Some countries have become successful in exporting during the crisis these goods, and now, thanks to them, somehow, despite the export restrictions put in place by the EU or the US, these goods tend to be available. But clearly, we could be in a situation where it would not be the case. It's also because of the difference in the timing of how countries were impacted by COVID-19. But if tomorrow we have a second wave, or if it's more the developing world, as we start to see, we could be in a situation where these export restrictions could really become an issue for the countries not producing any of these COVID-19 goods. Because I talk about interdependencies, but these interdependencies are mostly between the OECD countries that were on my slides. But you have also a lot of developing countries that have no capacity in most of the goods I've talked about. And for them, they really depend on trade. And for them, the export restrictions could be really a big issue in the future.
Okay. So we have a question here from Charissa Young of the Straits Times. She's the DC correspondent for the Straits Times. President Trump repeatedly says he wants to reshore the pharmaceutical industry to the US. How feasible is this given its overwhelming dependence on China for raw materials and core chemicals right now? What do you think of his push? Rosemary, thoughts?
Sure. Well, we have empty and mothballed plants, drug manufacturing plants here in the United States, and they can be started up. We still have the skilled workforce to do that. And once you create demand for the finished goods and the active ingredients made here, then you can gradually create demand for some of the key starting materials produced here. Yep. This shift took 30 years, and it's not going to happen overnight. But I think identifying the most critical medicines that are essential for the functioning of a healthcare system, it's very feasible to do it. And I don't think any country has an option. Certainly the United States doesn't have an option to do that, not to do it.
Gary, quick thought on that?
Yeah, just a quick point. I think the last comment Rosemary said is also very important. We have to choose among a large number of products, those that are really most essential. But secondly, some of the newer pharmaceutical companies are actually using advanced manufacturing methods and different ways of developing these products. So there was just a $350 million grant issued a couple of weeks ago to a Virginia-based startup company that is using advanced manufacturing methods to produce a variety of generic pharmaceutical active ingredients. So I think that's another thing we need to be exploring in the US, not just the old ways of making these products, but some new ways that could give companies more flexibility perhaps in producing a greater range of these active ingredients. And some of that seems to be coming online.
Okay, so I think we're just gonna have time for two fairly quick text questions. We've gone a couple minutes over, but as long as the speakers are willing, we'll get these questions in. This is for you, Rosemary. I would think, for clarity, are the core materials naturally occurring in China, or are these man-made chemicals where the production facilities are based in China? In other words, does China rely on other countries for its core materials in order to make base chemicals?
My understanding is that they are the production source.
Okay. And final question from Shannon Teo of Straits Times is dealing with test kits. Here in Malaysia, in the ASEAN region, places like Indonesia and the Philippines, there's been a situation about whether we were able to test aggressively enough given the need to produce test kits. Is there data about the trade of these test kits, and do you have much to say about the kind of bottlenecks of that supply chain? Gary?
I think that that test kit innovation I happened to mention coming from NUS Duke, I know they're planning on exporting that as quickly as possible. So I think some exporting is occurring, but typically it's the test kits are probably assembled in the place that they're being used. So you don't necessarily export whole kits. But again, maybe Sébastien has some information on the trade side for the test kits.
Yeah, so I mean, it's difficult to get data because you have like a global industry which is in vitro diagnostic, but it covers many different types of tests, and the ones that are specific to COVID-19 is difficult. But according to some data, now the main exporters are clearly China, South Korea, and Switzerland. So my impression is that it's not difficult at this stage to get these test kits, even if all countries have tried to increase the number of tests. But the scaling up in this industry was maybe easier in the sense that it's not too I mean, you have the issue of sourcing some reagents, and it is an issue for specific countries, but the manufacturing process is not so difficult and can be reproduced easily. So like South Korea managed to produce millions of test kits per day. And so clearly they don't have an issue in sourcing the input. So I would say test kits are okay at this stage.